Twist villains for a long time have been a very popular topic online amidst the discussion of Disney or other animated characters. One that keeps going on YouTube, as I have found out for my most popular videos for some reason, aiming at the ones that usually have worked to greater degrees while also criticizing the worst they have to offer. But looking back on the terrible pile of Twist villains as mentioned thousands of times before, is where you can't help but go back to the biggest source of regret. One that comes from an alright film known as Big Hero 6, Disney's first and only major animated film to date to be adapted from their Marvel comics. Because for the most part, this film is a good time with a very interesting world and a setting that could be built upon in this team of heroes, but just lacked greatly when it came down to the main conflict itself. A conflict that is built around one of Disney's worst villains ever in Robert Callahan, or Yokai as he's named for the most of it. The third Disney twist villain they have done in their new revival era of animation, thinking that this would benefit the story for the most. But looking back on the movie now, shows how evident that this era of Disney villainy actually sucked, as they did not know how to properly write them. And that is something that really sucks, because I truly find this movie to be a good, fun, emotional time that had a really great message about grief and moving on and finding that relationship in others when the ones we know pass away. And of course, in Disney animation, finding new ways to tell their stories that is now included within their purchase of Marvel. And when you speak about Marvel, you usually speak about good villains too. Not that Marvel has really had any great ones recently, even though I still believe in others like Kang and they should really stick with that, but just more of what we usually expect in the challenges our foes face in a unique way, which is not something this movie actually ever attempted to do at all, for what it had being a superhero story in that very sense. And this all comes at a time where by next year, this movie will become 10 years old, highlighting the newer period of Disney films that like to play it safe with familiar formulas and whatever they actually found worked, which it kind of actually didn't in that way. They had some good ideas at first, trying to adapt the least known comic book story from Marvel, but also decided to backtrack on what they decided to do in those concepts to do what they were already good at doing, coming off of the heels of Frozen being the unexpected success it was, and also Wreck-It Ralph, really changing the game for villainy at the time. This is important to mention because of course of King Candy himself, who was played by none other than Alan Tudyk, or as we all know, Disney's new Lucky Charm, just like John Ratzenberger was for Pixar, being in almost every single modern Disney film you've seen to date, especially becoming a big character in their newer film Wish, which I would also love to believe is also a twist villain in my heart because of that path he actually paved. Because when you go back to the past, he did play twist villains like Turbo, and then played another villain again in Frozen in the form of the Duke of Weaseltown. The other main perceived villain before was horribly twisted into something else like Prince Hans, a pattern that Disney somehow found funny based on the fact that he played those villainous characters. Where once again, that leapt over here into Big Hero 6 with the character of Alistar Cray, the initial perceived villain of this story before they twisted that too into Callahan himself. And the importance of mentioning him here this early before we get into Yokai himself is him again being the main intended villain in early drafts of the story, much like Elsa was for Frozen, but then changed later on because they thought it was too obvious. But when you look deeper into the overall story, it just makes actually more sense to why he would be the villain as the stats line up, wanting Hiro to actually work for him and his microbots, and then promoting the projects he made for his own gain. All which made for at least a competent villain that we would usually suspect, until they actually decided after looking at their last two previous films again that used a twist villain without thinking in regards of those very stories. Because instead of the usual villainous formula, they thought it would be best to pick a character for more shock value to the audience similar to Frozen, choosing to pick someone you would least expect at all and surprise you towards the end with no indication whatsoever that their story should align with that. Something that is the absolute worst type of villain you can ever produce, but one that can work nonetheless in the singular moment that you watch because you never knew it in the first place. The reason I mention this is because this is where you have to dive deep into the earlier drafts of the story with having Cray as that villain, where he would have used and brainwashed Tadashi and Callahan, who both would have survived the explosion, using them as scapegoats for his nefarious plans. And because of that, we now have 3 prime candidates for our main antagonist which way we would go. And considering we would actually want to be more obscure in our villain, we have to highlight our twist being either Tadashi or Callahan in that regard. And I've watched some people say online that using Tadashi would have worked for the story, but with what we actually learned in the overall finished story with the relationship that Baymax and Hiro have, it actually doesn't work quite well, being centered around grief and actually moving on, where his death actually has a major impact on his life. Yes, you can make the argument that it makes more sense for him being that way as a twist villain compared to Callahan, but looking into how they actually wanted to perceive the emotion they wanted to convey with his character, it seems more fit that he would be the one to die still, as it does have a major impact on his life to do better, and how Baymax himself is actually an extension of Tadashi, or Tadashi himself in a new form, seeking to help people for the better as a personal healthcare companion bot, rather than the rougher edges his younger brother was doing, taking the fight with his microbots in his eager impulses. And because of that side of the story was solved, it leaves you with only one option, being Callahan himself as your new major villain, and adds plenty of new interesting ideas to actually take the story to be a parallel to Hiro's. Here you have someone whose character also suffers from grief, but in the opposite way to how our hero is actually going through, thinking in terms of what almost happened during their first meeting and again towards the end with Cray, because of characters like Abigail and Tadashi who are actually not there anymore. But of course, with what we actually know in the story, this is something they did not decide to do or flesh out in any way, giving us so little to work on with his own background and then making it worse with his initial statements about Tadashi that everyone memes on at this point.
He went in there to save you!
That was his mistake!
And thinking about this part more and more, and if they didn't actually include that line in the twist, then maybe it could have actually been more justifiable for him to being the villain. Actually adding more context and time to actually show us that point, rather than actually writing off his best student like that makes no sense whatsoever. Because how can he be so heartless to say that it was his mistake being there at the same time trying to save him, when we know damn well he is his prized student and they both value each other? Because this is where you have to rewind the clock and circle back to the beginning with his very character, with his description reading that Professor Robert Callahan was an aspiring man, a world-renowned scientist praised for his inventions and foundations on robotics, as well as the creation of Callahan's law of robotics that Hiro also looked up to. With such recognition and knowledge, Robert actually put himself to good use by teaching as the head professor at the San Francisco Institute of Technology, where he mentored such prodigies as the brilliant Tadashi Hamada, whom he admired greatly. Everyone that we knew that is a part of the team were his students, and he paid them with such great respect, wanting those like Hiro to actually learn under him and grow and develop as students for the future of humanity. What we know at this point in the story leads us to believe that he wants to help develop his talents rather than having sell out to a man who cuts corners to achieve his giant tech company that everyone actually knows about. The tone that already keeps setting the obvious for who the villain is, and rather than who is the compassionate person who wants to see our main character develop and grow as the main hero of this story. It just makes much more sense to his own persona and goes to why another character like Alistar Cray would want that tech compared to Callahan. But they somehow overlooked that point instead and gave us this crap. Because when you actually go later in the film, when they go to the island, they shut that technology off where this portal experiment went wrong, where the team was also led to believe by this point that he was trying to clean up his mistakes that was mentioned earlier. Every sign just led them into the right direction that Alistar was the main villain of this film. Events that begin with how he kept a microbot until Tadashi told him to give it back, the fire starting after this conversation, and then the failed experiment just before. It just makes more logical sense to why he actually wanted to think this way and what he felt compared to Callahan, who welcomed Hiro to the robotics lab and generally helped his students to succeed. Instead, all now revealed under the guidance of being a villain because he lost his daughter. And when you think about that and what he said about Tadashi, it just really doesn't add up whatsoever to the lengths he went to this point, not caring at all about his prized student who tried to save him from that fire he started himself, and then causing a loss for Hiro similar to his own, where at least on his end of the spectrum where the portal's collapsing, there was still a chance to actually save his daughter rather than a confirmed death with Tadashi inside an exploding building that he himself actually worked in, foregoing his previous life for this new one, not caring about the consequences at all, and who actually valued him with where he worked at. I mean, yes, this story and life does actually show that grief impacts us in so many ways and makes us do irrational things, but when you don't actually show that or explain that like you tried to do with Hiro's side on that actually works for the story and is very emotional, then it really doesn't actually make any sense at all, because Callahan never developed those proper feelings. It shows some of us that you never really intended to go with that direction the story was structured around and designed a certain way. Just having a caring character actually turn on society just like that, just for his own daughter, and doing anything to succeed, including attempting to kill his own former students. I mean, he might have not known it clearly at the time of who he was fighting with apart from a distance, but he was still very adamant about attacking people with no care. Similar to the first scene with him and Hiro that painted him as such a nefarious faceless villain that only wore a kabuki mask to use his own microbots against him. The way he's portrayed again seems more fitting of a character like Cray of what he's after rather than being the complete opposite. That there's no rational explanation to why he attacks people the way he does compared to what he initially cared about in some way, as even other characters like Honey Lemon said that Callahan was such a good man, now doing a complete 180 trying to stop them and ending Kray's life in this way. It just doesn't add up to what we expect a villain to be shaped of, or even a Marvel villain, might I add, with what one of the tech supervisors said about his character about what makes Marvel villains interesting. He said that they are righteous, they think that they're doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing in this case, which makes them more human and relatable, and that Yokai is not a villain in his own mind. Most of which are true, but that doesn't actually apply to Yokai himself, thinking about what he does on a shorter scale compared to other Marvel villains like Thanos, who we actually know and actually love because of those mentioned attributes that he said. He thinks he's doing the right thing by saving the universe and its resources, which makes his motivations understandable but not excusable. But the thing about him is the fact that he was developed this way over time with various movies and already presented as a big threat who must be stopped, compared to Yokai coming out of the blue at every turn attacking people and then having that point revealed later on in the story. That is not how a villain, or a Marvel or Disney villain for that matter, should be developed if you want them to have some sort of sympathetic trait involved, especially ones that are supposed to be a dark parallel to our main hero himself, which is a very interesting concept nonetheless for him, considering that all that he does actually turned out for nothing and under the regret of losing what he loves, but could have only worked if it was introduced under a different story, as after his defeat, they discover not all was lost, saving Abigail in the end. He just never seeks to consider any of his actions at all, or has any chance to explain those, like other Marvel villains, much more about his own grief rather than just having them there mask it all up for the majority of it and then hint at regret at the very end. Just never learning for any of his actions until Big Hero 6 the series came out, when Hiro actually went to talk to him in a scene in prison, being a better form than what the movie actually produced. This is where he provides his full apology for what he did previously, the regret he faces for taking full responsibility for Tadashi's death and never actually meaning to hurt anyone. But the problem with this is the fact that he said this too late after the movie itself, with the direction they went, and saying that he never meant to hurt anyone, when we know full well that he almost directly killed his own students because of that vengeance. We see there in scenes like this that it just doesn't make any logical sense to what he said as a character when it was designed on face value as a normal villain, or Aleister Kray himself. This is where I want to mention the main villain of the series being Obake in the show's first season, a villain who seems more fit for where they actually wanted to go in Big Hero 6. Like Callahan, he mainly works in the shadows. Of course, he's not like Yokai in the ways we see, but still operates from a hidden angle, where Obake does actually mean ghost, which fits his hidden sociopathic behavior. Obake in the series was actually motivated solely for recognition of his genius and success, where whatever cataclysm could come from it was just a necessary evil for the world to actually improve under his vision. Things that just make more sense for him considering the work that Hiro and those around him actually did, pursuing science and technology for the better of their world in their own way, even if it comes at a price. I don't really want to get into him as a character, but just more the basic essence of who he was and what he actually fit compared to someone like Callahan in that world and their motivations of being a villain out of loss or something. A character like Obake just being more for himself actually fits this very story. And this is something that also fits more within Kray's failures with the experiment that actually caused Abigail to disappear and wanting Hiro's microbots at the very beginning. How it's all laid right then and there to be a villain and make perfect sense, and actually could have worked similar to the way of the first draft. Because like I said earlier, those first drafts had Aleister being the main villain and have Callahan and Tadashi survive the explosion and become controlled by him. In this new design, I actually propose having Callahan still survive and still playing the role he had, although this time mind controlled to become the villain that we know, making the twist still work but under a larger figure like Aleister himself that turns it back to him away from the obvious tones. It just makes much more sense too, considering Alan Tudyk actually played King Candy and Turbo, who was a deeper layered twist villain, being of course the manipulator behind the events of characters like Vanellope becoming a Glitch, and of course being Turbo himself, where you realize the same could be said here with Callahan being responsible for it but then revealing that it was Kray all along behind the scenes pulling the strings, adding more to the same decisions keeping the story they wanted with Baymax and Hiro about grief over Tadashi. This one actually offers more development under the same backstory, with having Kray trying to save face, committing to rescuing Abigail from that portal realm while also trying to paint Callahan as a reason his projects failed. That animosity that could have been explained a bit more earlier, as we seen in those clips, the general did order the shutdown of this and actually lambasted Kray for this failure and potentially caused damage to his company's reputation. Like Obake in this situation, his motivations are about success, no setbacks whatsoever being a positive light in this community of San Francisco and the world itself, keeping the same tone in villainy but also the twist they actually wanted to come along with it. I mean, it could be that, or either as most suggest, just adding more context to his own character in Callahan, not just the one-liners mentioning his daughter and his anger here and there, explaining it a bit further to why he should be motivated this way instead of betraying the trust he had with others that he actually cared about from before and then wanting to kill them after. Rewrite it so at least it actually makes some sort of sense out of his grief that parallels Hiro's in that regard, explaining to him that this was all an accident and more of what he searches for to try and kill Cray, which still actually paints him as the one at being at fault now more that I think about it. It still can be the same story that you had, but just adding more context to why he should be the way he is, which makes it much more believable. Just like what they did with King Candy before that, which they didn't learn after. Doing the same exact thing from Frozen and then on in this terrible era. The point being here is just make it make sense and the entire story will satisfy itself. Because like I said before, Big Hero 6 is a decent story that I like with a great message, but just had a terrible villain added to its name that actually makes it suffer. A disappointing thing to note considering where Marvel properties have ended up on the big screen to this very day. Not that it should continue with these Disney sequels or more stories that they already had with the side content they produce, but more with the state of storytelling that has been for them and of course Disney as a whole. But in the era we are now, I'm just glad that this idea of twist villains are now over, where hopefully we could move back to the normal formula in some way, where we all know they need villains, but just not badly written ones. And with that all said, I'm all done, so goodbye.